Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Dick Lehr, who is a professor of journalism at Boston University and a former reporter at the Boston Globe, where he was part of the Spotlight team and won numerous awards and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for investigative reporting. The author of 7 award-winning books of nonfiction and fiction. His latest book, just out, is White Hot Hate, a true story of domestic terrorism in America's Heartland. Welcome to Background Briefing, Dick Lehr.
Thank you, Ian. Good to be with you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And your book is essential reading because this problem is still with us. I mean, you could make the case that Donald Trump gave Americans permission to become racist again. It's like he lifted up a rock with all of his birther conspiracies, which was the opening volley of his election campaign, starting in 2013, when he came back from Moscow with the FSB orders to get into to revive American racism. And frankly, it's been very, very successful.
Yeah, I know.
And this is a story about people that follow Trump and see him as their leader, as their Führer, and he's not going away. And frankly, I don't see much difference between much of what you reported about this plan to go after Somalis and Muslims in the heartland of Kansas, inspired by Trump, and what's happening today with Boebert calling the Somali American Congresswoman Ilhan Omar a Muslim and a terrorist, and et cetera, et cetera. So it lives on, doesn't it, the problem?
Oh, absolutely. And it's as if Trump helped invent a playbook that these others have adopted. There's no question in this story, in White Hot Hate, that these terrorists, domestic terrorists, were inspired by Trump. He's a thread throughout the book. This unfolds in 2016 when he was then a presidential candidate. But one of his primary campaign promises was the Muslim ban. And these men in southwest Kansas who were gun-toting, far-right militia members and white nationalists, heeded that call and said, but we need to take it a step further because there's already plenty of Muslims around us. And every one of them, in their minds, was an ISIS terrorist. So their idea of a solution was to exterminate them. And that was all, behind the bomb plot, the conspiracy to create weapons of mass destruction that this case is all about.
But what's happening and continues to persist, it seems, Dick, is that the sort of public face, the mainstreaming of hate through people like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar and others, along with Trump, who's certainly not gone away, and Trump himself going back to 2016 and since then, that's happening at the one level, but the people that are being influenced by it are out there. And I'm assuming at some point or other, aren't we going to have some kind of copycat?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's everyone's great concern, including our national security apparatus, Homeland Security, the FBI, which was slow to pivot from international terrorists to now recognizing that domestic terrorism is the primary threat to national security, is looking for the next event or cabal to unfold. And yeah, that's a huge worry. And I just think, it's important, and I don't know what the solution is, maybe you too, but is to keep calling it out. And calling out that the harm that's done by again, the proponents who are working from this Islamophobic hate book, playbook. I write about this in my book, and I know the New York Times columnist David Brooks has written extensively about what he calls the fear and xenophobia that's consuming America today. We need somehow to come up with solutions, but it's important not to turn our backs and on all the hate and the darkness. And I think this was a unique opportunity in this instance, in Garden City bomb plot, to really get down into it and understand how these kinds of things can happen, a bit of the why, but who are these people? What are they really like? there were the resources available for a storyteller, a nonfiction writer like myself, to really tell the story beyond headlines, which there were plenty when this case erupted. The men were arrested on the eve of the election in 2016. There was another round of headlines during their trial in 2018, and then again 2 years ago when they were finally sentenced. I think that's one of the values of this is not to turn your back on this, but to see how one of these events really potentially can happen. And again, the good news here is that, and there's some uplift at the end, that the bombs did not go off.
Well, let's go through the story without giving too much away, because I really urge people to get the book. And frankly, here I'm calling you from Los Angeles, Dick, and every other person in this town. If you go to Starbucks, you've got people writing screenplays in the corner on their laptops. So this reads like a movie, and I urge all of those wannabe screenwriters out there to get the book, because you cannot make this stuff up. But essentially, you have these hateful characters, Patrick Stein, Curtis Allen, and Gavin Wright, members of the 3% militia then, but that wasn't sort of radical enough for them, so they formed their own Kansas security force, virulent racists, inspired by Trump and the anti-Muslim rhetoric, and going after the local Somali community of immigrants, calling them cockroaches, which of course is what the Hutus call the Tutsis in Rwanda. And then you have this, lucky accident that one of them, that Dan Day, who knew them all, obviously, since they were children, he couldn't go along with it all. And we can get into how the FBI recruited him, but through him, and you've had access to the actual bugging that he was responsible for. So you actually hear these people say what they say and cheer when Trump makes these speeches about going after Muslims and stuff. It's so frighteningly real. And had they pulled this attempt off to blow up a mosque and blow up the apartment buildings where these Somali immigrants lived, it would have been worse than probably one of the worst terrorist incidents short of 9/11, right?
Right. Well, the sentencing judge, the federal judge who sentenced those three men that you mentioned, said if they had succeeded, it would have been, the devastation and the deaths would have been worse than what Timothy McVeigh accomplished at the Oklahoma City bombing. And in fact, on the tapes, you hear the men referring to Timothy McVeigh. They want to do a McVeigh on the Muslims. You hear them referring to the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, because in addition to building bombs, they decide that they need to author a manifesto, a call to arms. This extermination that's happening in Garden City, they're hoping will launch a crusade. I mean, that's what they self-anointed themselves as a smaller cell within the Kansas Security Force as the Crusaders. They were crusading against the Muslims. And they saw themselves with the success they hoped for of killing all these Somalis in Garden City, to inspire like-minded events around the country against Muslims in America. And so the manifesto, which again was seized by the government when the men were arrested, and it's the kind of resources that as a journalist here want to get my hands on, and it's jaw-dropping stuff. Calling for Americans to stand up and save America against the Muslim invasion,
And again, I'm speaking with Dick Lehr, who's a professor of journalism at Boston University and a former reporter at the Boston Globe, where he was part of the Spotlight team and won numerous awards and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for investigative reporting, the author of 7 award-winning books of fiction and nonfiction. His latest book, just out, is White Hot Hate, a true story of domestic terrorism in America's Heartland. So you got hold of the actual surveillance tapes that were secretly recorded by Dan Day.
Yes.
And you had to listen to these hateful people, particularly Patrick Stein. That must have given you chills, right, when you actually heard these real plots being hatched.
Absolutely. And again, and then, thousands upon thousands of pages of transcript, because these meetings went on for 7-8 months, and the meetings, each meeting might last 3 to 4 hours, and only snippets of it ultimately make it into the federal trial against these men, because those excerpts that go to the conspiracy. But as a writer and wanting to tell the fuller story, it's what else they talk about that's interesting. It could be about guns. It could be about other possible plans they might have, and not just the Muslims, but how about the landlords who are renting to them? It could be about sleepy Joe Biden. It could be about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. None of that makes it into the trial, but it's all revelatory in terms of the way these guys think. One, Curtis Allen, couldn't stop talking about how much love he had for Alex Jones. And in fact, to loop back for a second to the manifesto, Curtis was the main author of the manifesto, and they were talking about when to mail it out to get publicity, either before or after the bombing. And Curtis claimed that, let's call Alex Jones. He'll put us on live and let us read it out loud. So another part of the theme of this is the role of far-right media, the role of Facebook and social media, in sustaining and enabling these men to, go well down the road in creating these fertilizer bombs, just like Timothy McVeigh did, that they hope to use to kill a whole bunch of Somalis who were living and working in Garden City, Kansas.
So how much is this the case of the cart before the horse, or vice versa? In other words, the hate is there, but these people like Alex Jones and right-wing media, and particularly Tucker Carlson, who's aggressively rewriting the history of what happened on January the 6th. This has January the 6th written all over it, your new book, White Hot Hate. It seems almost like the sort of psychological diagnosis of many of those people, the ones that we saw on video.
Absolutely.
smashing the glass and defecating and desecrating.
Yeah. I think you read White Hot Hate and kind of absorb all, again, because of the resource that I was able to access to tell the story. You see how January 6th happened. There's a direct line between that. In fact, after the January 6th takeover of the Capitol, Dan Day called, and
Dan
watching
Day's,
the TV.
Dan Day's your the informant.
He was the local Garden City guy who became an FBI informant, and then putting his life at risk, secretly recorded all these meetings that so ultimately at trial the men basically convicted themselves in their own words because of the tapes. And he was the key witness at the federal trial against him. But after January 6th, he's calling me. He goes, those guys weren't in prison. They would have been at the Capitol. He had no doubt in his mind, that they would have, responded to the recruiting for that in the days and weeks leading up to that event. And again, I'll go back that there's been plenty of arrests, whether international or domestic terrorist cases, but most of them plead out. And it's hard to get beyond the headlines and some of the pleadings that are in court that may include some of the evidence and whatnot. But without a full-blown trial like we had here, you never can, and even the trial only takes the story so far. It's just the rules of evidence and everything else. But once the trial's over, which is when I was fortunate enough to step into the story, the entire record becomes potentially available. And that means, like, as you mentioned, all of the tapes, not just those that had evidentiary value to the charges at hand, but everything. And that's when you can create this, this dark world that was unfolding out there in Southwest Kansas, and tapping into the militia movement. There's these great scenes, Ian, between there's a moment when the three men who are the key conspirators, they're trying to recruit some of their other militia members to join them, thinking they could use some more help. And there becomes an amazing debate about a militia, the purpose of a militia, and the competing visions of what a militia is. Because obviously Patrick Stein and his cohorts believed that they no longer wanted to be what they called keyboard patriots. They had to take action, eliminate, exterminate what they called the cockroaches, the Muslims. Some of these other militia, they said, whoa, there's no way I'm going out there to just shoot people. Their view of a militia was we're stockpiling, we're prepping guns and food in the event of a defensive measure. I mean, they weren't necessarily fans of Muslim immigrants, but they were only going to be ready in case someone came at them. It might be the federal government, because that's a big strand of the anti-government and all that. But they were, they could not buy into Patrick Stein and Curtis Allen and Gavin's Wright notion that we have to go on the offensive and go to war.
But they were pragmatic enough not to do anything until after Trump got elected. They didn't want to hurt his chances in 2016. But
originally, they were. I'm sorry, I was just going to say originally they were thinking of doing it on the anniversary of 9/11. They weren't going to be ready, and then you're absolutely right. They just said, well, we better wait until after the election.
Right. So it's just so clear the connection between Trump's words at Charlottesville, good people on both sides. He's never going to repudiate these people. But
no, and then,
I still want to get a sense, if I can, from you, Dick, from what you learned in terms of what. Because I look at these militia types, and they frankly look like clowns. They look pathetic. I mean, what the hell are you worried about? Why do you have to have an assault rifle on the streets of America? Why are you decked out head to toe in Kevlar and camo? I mean, it's a goddamn joke. Are the Martians coming? Well, there's a level of pathetic folly to it, but there's also the deadly reality.
Yeah, I know. It's a toxic combination, that's for sure. There is this sort of sense of buffoonery about them, quality, but you're right, they're deadly serious, and they work themselves up in a lather in what I'll call, that echo chamber of white nationalism and the far right extremism that the media, that brand of media and social media and Facebook, they're not alone anymore. They find themselves these guys found themselves on Facebook, connected through Facebook, and then they're off and running. They learned how to make bombs through Facebook and online, downloading all these recipes for fertilizer bombs the way that Timothy McVeigh did, and slowly, they're hardly efficient. Over the course of the summer of 2016, they call a meeting and they'll have an agenda and whatnot. But boy, they might go off on a tangent talking about the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, they just go all over the map. They're not hardly an efficient bunch. But by the end of the summer, they had Curtis Allen and Gavin Wright had accomplished what I learned is the hardest part of making homemade bombs, and that is the blasting cap, the primary explosive, the detonator, which is the most volatile. And once you get past that, putting together the fertilizer and all that is really no big deal in the scheme of bomb making. And they had succeeded at that. Which was what got the FBI and the informant, and they had to come up with a what they call a smooth takedown plan.
So, just in closing, then, Dick Lehr, is there any insight you can offer us in terms of what can neutralize these people? I mean, at the risk of sounding like a North Korean talking about thought reform, how do you disabuse these paranoid Americans about these delusions they have? How do you neutralize this hatred?
I mean, I wish I knew. I'm sure that all of us wish we knew how to confront this more effectively than is happening. I know that Dan Day talks about, and others in Garden City, where there's a lot of diversity and immigrant population to work in the meatpacking plants, talking about getting to know everybody, people, and that's what the Somalis get to know us. In fact, the book opens with a Somali proverb, which a Somali that I met translated for me. It's in the translation is "Get to know me before you hate me." And I think there's something to be said about that, and just calling out the hate and say, wait, get to know these people before you hate them.
Right. Well, I thank you very much for joining us here today, Dick Lehr.
Well, thank you very much, Ian, for having me. Appreciate it.
And again, I've been speaking with Dick Lehr, who's a professor of journalism at Boston University and a former reporter at the Boston Globe, where he was part of the Spotlight team and won numerous awards and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for investigative reporting, the author of 7 award-winning books of nonfiction and fiction. His latest book, just out, is White Hot Hate, a true story of domestic terrorism in America's heartland. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into how crime has paid for Trump and his family, with Trump earning $1.7 billion while in office and Jared and Ivanka making $640 million on a White House salary of $1.